Oh, I hate that voice.
Good evening, Andrew. Thank you very much for making yourself available at short notice to just respond to the interview with Frans Cronje that has been distributed widely today. You are probably the person with the most understanding around the background to all this. So we'd love to hear your response to that message. That was.
But first, I must apologize. I don't know Frans Cronje. I don't know who he is. But I've been out of South Africa for quite a while. I see he was connected to the Institute for Race Relations, which unfortunately in the 1980s really sullied what had been a fairly good reputation by becoming extremely reactionary and actually did more damage to race relations than anything else. But so I'm just taking this from seeing this as some individual who has certain opinions. What it comes across to me as is a really disingenuous, and I'm sorry to have to use this word because I don't like it, but actually quite racist defense of the wanton slaughter of babies, women, and innocents in Gaza. So let's look at some of what he talks about. I mean, first, he is arguing for Israel to continue to receive unconditional military aid to prolong the slaughter, because we need to understand that Israel is being supplied with weapons on an almost daily basis to replenish the bombs and missiles, supposedly precision guided, but being dropped on an enormous number of hospitals, UN schools, places of residence, places of worship, all of which, by the way, are violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes. But perhaps Mr. Cronje would prefer a world where we had no international rule of law, where everybody could behave like Israel and simply decide to destroy an entire territory, an entire people, and then nobody should be able to criticize or speak out about that because it's Israel. So the idea of unconditional military aid is an absolutely terrifying one. As someone who's worked on the arms trade for 23 years, starting with the South African arms deal and all of its corruption, I just find that absolutely terrifying and incredibly, incredibly dangerous and stupid. His entire argument about the fact that South Africa is now some sort of a proxy for Iran, that we've been bought by Iran. And I should say that my organization, SWI, we actually made available over 6,000 pages of evidence to the Zondo Commission on State Capture. My colleague Paul Holden has published a book about state capture called Zondo in Your Pocket. I was forced out of Parliament because I investigated the massive corruption in our arms deal, which I argue was the first case of state capture. For Cronje to now claim that the South African state has been captured by Iran, I mean, could you perhaps present a bit of evidence? Because the only evidence seems to be the fact that South Africa, to great acclaim from the entire global South, and from millions and millions of people across the Western world as well, which he claims to be defending, all of whom turned out on the streets of their cities over this past weekend, he seems to be basing his claim of state capture by Iran on the fact that South Africa criticized Israel, and he thinks Israel is the great defender of Western liberal values and democracy. So it really reminded me, when I first listened to it, I actually thought, oh my goodness, what happened to the last 30 years? I'm back in 1980 South Africa, listening to yet more propaganda about the Swart Gevaar and the communists. And sorry to tell you, Mr. Cronje, and sorry to be rude about it, but that turned out to be bullshit, frankly. And so to now make these incredibly Islamophobic conspiracy theory arguments about Iran buying South Africa's foreign policy is really quite a juvenile way to try and defend Israel. If you want to defend Israel and what it's doing, Try and defend it on the legal merits of what it's doing. Don't make up these sort of nonsense conspiracy theories and scare tactics, because it's actually an insult to the intellect and intelligence of everyone who is listening to this recording. South Africa's foreign policy today is virtually identical to that which Mandela voiced in the first interviews after his release. And let us remind ourselves what he said. In the first interview with Ted Koppel, when he was asked about his criticism of Israel, he said, and please, these are available on YouTube and elsewhere online, so have a look at them. He said, Israel is an apartheid state. I know what apartheid is. I spent 27 years in jail as a consequence of fighting an apartheid state. Israel was apartheid South Africa's closest ally that provided enormous military aid, military training, and military support to the apartheid state, including helping it to become a nuclear power. And he went on to say, Nelson Mandela, that why would I not be critical of the greatest supporter and ally of my oppressor? Desmond Tutu, the late Archbishop, and let's remind ourselves that Mandela and Tutu are both Nobel Peace Prize laureates. Desmond Tutu went even further in his criticism of Israel, and he said that the apartheid that is practiced in Israel is even worse and more brutal than apartheid practiced in South Africa. So Mandela said, you need to understand, Mr. Koppel, that America's enemies are not necessarily South Africa's enemies. Then in a second interview on the same visit, this was before he was president, when he had just been released from jail, he was asked about why South Africa was friendly with Cuba. And he spoke very passionately, and he was very angry, which he didn't get very often. He said, when we were wallowing in jail on Robben Island, some of our colleagues, and he mentioned Thabo Mbeki, Oliver Tambo, and a couple of other names that I don't recall, some of our colleagues went first to the United States of America, and we spoke about the situation in our country, and we asked for help, and we asked for aid to help us overcome racist apartheid in South Africa. And we got nothing, he said. He said, we then went to Cuba, and we got everything we asked for. And he said to the interviewer, whose name I'm afraid I can't recall, he said to the interviewer, we won't abandon our friends. These are the friends who helped liberate us from apartheid. If it wasn't for these friends, I would still be in jail. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. And let us remember that Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the ultimate leaders of Western Europe and America. They called him a terrorist. They were quite happy for the apartheid regime to tell South Africans that Nelson Mandela was an evil communist ogre who would drive them into the sea, who would take their houses and their pools, and who would rape their daughters. And this is the same sort of nonsense that we are hearing from people like Frans Cronje and from Israeli propagandists about the Palestinian people. And as much as what the Western European, British, and American leaders said about Mandela and the ANC in those days is no different to what these people are saying about Palestinians today. It is deeply Islamophobic, and it is very, very dangerous. It is the stoking of fear when you don't have any other argument or defense of the fact that every day Israel is murdering 247 people in one of the most densely populated pieces of territory in the world. 48 of those people are women, 117 of them are children. Interestingly, foreign policy is the one area on which the ANC has remained consistent and steadfast. I have been remarkably critical of the ANC government since Thabo Mbeki's time. Thabo Mbeki called me on national television a traitor because I exposed the corruption in South Africa's arms deal. I have been extraordinarily critical of Jacob Zuma, who is nothing more than a criminal thug. And I am supposed to be giving evidence against Zuma in his corruption trial if the judiciary could get it together to actually allow that trial to take place. And I repeat that my organization has done an enormous amount of work on state capture. And we are known to work with prosecutors around the world to try and get those who aided and abetted state capture to face the legal consequences of their actions. And let us remind ourselves, because Mr. Cronje talks about Israel as fighting for the survival of liberal democracy in the Middle East and of fighting for Western values and the West. Let us remind ourselves that it is Western companies, huge Western companies, who aided, abetted, and facilitated state capture in South Africa. It's not Iran. Iran doesn't have the money to capture anybody or anything at this point in time. And when he talks about the survival of liberal democracy in the Middle East, I have some bad news for him. And I say this as a Jew. I say this as the son of a Holocaust survivor. I say this as the person who introduced the first ever motion on the Holocaust in the history of the South African parliament, both democratic and racist undemocratic. I say this as a person who has lectured at Auschwitz on genocide prevention, where my mother lost dozens of her own family. Israel has never been a democracy. Palestinian citizens of Israel have never, ever in the history of the Israeli state had the same rights, had the same legal protections as Israeli Jewish citizens. I'm afraid to say that that is a fact. So if he is using Israel as the hope of survival of liberal democracy in the Middle East, the bad news is it's already failed. Now, let us turn our attention to more than Israel, because Mr. Cronje talks about how Israel is the West's most important ally in the Middle East. Oh, he's right in that sense. But he forgets their other most important ally, who is as important to them as Israel, and that is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, which executes more people every year than any other country on the planet, including Iran. And I'm certainly not here to defend the Iranian regime. A good friend of mine was taken hostage by the Iranian regime when she visited her family there with her 1-year-old daughter. She spent 5.5 years in an Iranian jail. And my organization helped her husband eventually free her from Iranian jail. So I'm no supporter of the Iranian regime. But we should bear in mind that by comparison to the West's other great ally in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran is certainly no worse than those countries. And let us also not forget that despite its own appalling human rights record, its record is probably the most corrupt and corrupting nation on the planet, certainly in my field of research and work, which is the global arms trade, which accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. In addition to all of that, Saudi Arabia has been violating international humanitarian law, committing war crimes, and violating the rules of war in Yemen, supplied yet again, just like Israel, by the US, the UK, and Western Europe. Over 20,000 innocent civilians have died as a consequence of Saudi Arabia's bombing of Yemen. So if these are the paragons of virtue that are going to ensure the survival of Western liberal democracy, then I'm afraid, Mr. Cronje, the game is already over. Let me also remind you of one other thing. It was the Western governments, particularly the governments of the United Kingdom and the United States, through their remarkably incompetent intelligence agencies, who actually overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran under the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. And that is when the spiral of human rights abuses, violence, and intolerance started in Iran. First under the Shah of Iran, another mate of apartheid South Africa's, by the way, and then with the Islamic regime that replaced the Shah's brutal human rights abusing regime. Now, as a consequence of which, I would like to suggest, in opposition to Mr. Cronje's perspective, that in fact, it is Western governments, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, that have been more responsible for instability, for conflict, and for immiseration and suffering of innocent people in the Middle East than anyone or anything else. But in addition, I would like to say to Mr. Cronje, who claims that South Africa is incredibly well-reasoned, incredibly compelling, and brilliantly argued submission to the International Court of Justice. He claims that that submission is just one series of anti-Semitic tropes after another. Now, as a Jew and someone who suffered anti-Semitism from a young age when I was at school in Cape Town, and then, interestingly, suffered anti-Semitism again during my maiden speech in the South African Parliament, when a number of members of the National Party, as I was talking on the remarkably boring post-office budget bill, started shouting at me in Afrikaans, "You communists, you communists, you communists," and eventually, then Deputy Minister Jill Marcus intervened and asked these members why they were calling me a communist, given that I'd never been a member of the South African Communist Party or any other communist party for that matter. Their response was, well, he's a Jew and he's a member of the ANC. They were kicked out of the chamber that day for that anti-Semitic trope. And Mr. Cronje, who claims that South Africa's submission to the ICJ is a series of anti-Semitic tropes, unfortunately engages in his own anti-Semitic trope in his 10-minute interview. Why? Because he conflates all Jews with the state of Israel and the state of Israel with all Jews. Now, the reality is, and Mr. Cronje, maybe you don't know that many Jews. I'm not sure. I don't know you. But the reality is, Jews everywhere, not just in South Africa, not just in Israel, Jews everywhere have a wide diversity of political opinions. And I hope this doesn't shock you too much. But in Jewish intellectual and political history, of which I'm incredibly proud to be a part, as long as there has been the political ideology of Zionism, which is a current in Jewish political and intellectual thought, but as long as it has existed, there has been the current of anti-Zionist Jewish political and intellectual thought. Now, I'm not sure whether you think it's appropriate for you to decide whether it's only Zionist Jews who are real Jews and anti-Zionist Jews aren't, so you just ignored them in some of the statements you made in that interview. But as a Jew myself, and not believing myself to be some form of deity, I actually see the Jewish community in South Africa, the Jewish community all around the world, as a broad and diverse community. And that's why in Israel itself, there are many Jews, some of whom are extremely religious, ultra-Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionist. There are many Jews, both within the state of Israel and way beyond the state of Israel in many parts of the world, who are incredibly critical of the state of Israel and who don't believe that what Israel is doing in Gaza should in any way reflect on them as Jews. And that is why on all of these marches, like we are seeing all over the world, where hundreds of thousands of people are taking to the streets of London, of Paris, of Berlin, of New York, of Chicago, of all parts of the world, millions and millions of people in total, there are hundreds of thousands of Jews amongst them who are marching very proudly as Jews to say, not in my name, to say we are Jews against genocide. Now, those Jews didn't seem to feature in your interview. So, to suggest that South Africa's submission was in any way anti-Semitic, the fact that a government of a country that has managed to overcome a system of legislated racial oppression, which I would say is part of the motivation of why South Africa took Israel to the ICJ, to say that their submission was anti-Semitic is unfortunately using the remarkably disingenuous tactic of weaponizing anti-Semitism to shut down all and any criticism of the state of Israel, as the Israeli government consciously sets out to do, and actually established a ministry to focus specifically on trying to identify any support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the same BDS that was crucial in ending apartheid in South Africa, to try and stop such a movement against Israel gaining momentum. Ministers who served in the Israeli government have said publicly, again, you can find these on YouTube, that Israel consciously decided on a strategy of identifying all criticism of the Israeli state as anti-Semitic. Now, here's something else for you, Mr. Cronje. I find the weaponization of anti-Semitism in this way to justify the slaughter of innocent people, wherever they may be, whatever color, ethnicity, religion, or nationality they may be, an insult to the memory of the 12 million people who died in the Holocaust. And I said something very similar in my address to Parliament when I introduced the first ever motion on the Holocaust in the history of that Parliament. And I was incredibly proud to do so in front of my mother, who was a survivor, and about 24 other survivors of the Holocaust who had been brought to Parliament from various parts of South Africa. I have to say that Mr. Cronje's segment is one of the least informed propaganda pieces trying to defend the indefensible that I have heard in a very long time. It uses the outdated and discredited ideas of a clash of civilization. It uses a demonization of Muslims in, frankly, an Islamophobic way that I find extremely, extremely troubling. Now, the only way in which one can suggest that criticism of the Israeli state for what it has been doing in Gaza for the last 2 months is somehow acceptable, the only way you can render that acceptable is if you hold the belief that one Israeli Jewish life is somehow of more value than one Muslim, Christian, or person of no faith Palestinian life. Because there is no other way that you can justify, after the tragic and abhorrent killing of around 1,300 Israelis, that the equally abhorrent and tragic killing of so far 23,000 Palestinians makes sense. And while I've been talking, one Palestinian woman and 3 Palestinian children would have been killed by the Israeli state. Now, if you actually believe that there is a different value in these lives, then I'm afraid you would have to admit that you are both a racist and a white supremacist. So finally, let me say that when my mother taught me the idea that developed after the horrors of the Holocaust and the end of the Second World War, the notion developed of never again. And when I asked her why she would go out early in the morning with the black sash and protest against South African apartheid, while I'd have much more preferred her to be at home with me having breakfast, she explained to me this concept of never again. But it was never again just for Jews. It was never again for all human beings. And that is why, as a proud Jew, I am highly critical and will remain highly critical of Israel's actions in Gaza since the tragedy of 7 of October. And it's why I don't want to see another human life taken. Because for me, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, people of no faith are all of equal value. And if our own history of apartheid taught us one thing, it is that all life, that all human beings are of equal value. And we had a president in whose name and spirit I believe our submission was made to the ICJ, who showed every single human being he came into contact with, including his jailers, including the wife of the architect of apartheid, because he believed that all humans are equal and that all humans deserve equal respect and equal rights, including the right to life.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a very powerful response to that video, and it will be my privilege to make that available to people who have been sharing the interview with Frans all day today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the time.